So, like I said, thinking product analytics. And what I consider product analytics is essentially, I mean, it's not, it would be a subset of analytics in general, right? If you're looking at A/B testing, if you're looking at basically any kind of statistics, we apply that, we apply strategy, and we look at product from that perspective. And that's what we are going to talk about today. So I know there are 3 questions in your mind right now. One is, who is this guy? Why should we listen to him? Does he have dog pictures? And when you talk to a dog owner, that's a risk you run anyway. So yeah, these are 2 of my dogs. Oh, both of my dogs. Obi and Wayne. That's important. I'll quiz you on that later. So just give you a quick rundown of where I've been. I have been a heavily technical person early in my career. I was a programmer with IBM. I was an engineer with Sony, worked on the PlayStation for a bit. I worked on Sony Pictures and did my MBA at UOM, Go Blue. Anybody from Michigan here? Yes, Go Blue. I was at Groupon. I ran an analytics team there, which is kind of where I really got into analytics. And then I've been at Amazon for almost 4 years now. I am part of the Prime Video team. That is the streaming service at Amazon. Anybody use it? Do you guys watch Prime Video? Perfect. Keep doing more of that. All right. So that is enough about me. What will we talk about today? So analytics in product management. Of course, I mean, when you think about statistics and analytics, it's a very broad field. But what does that mean from a product management perspective? We will talk about that. So when you get questions from the interviewer, what are they really looking to get out of you? It's not like it's more than just statistical rigor. It's more than the accuracy that you can bring to the table. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The meat of it is going to be on the second part, where we are talking about analytics, why the structure of the questions, and what should you be thinking about when you're asked one. And finally, we'll get a little bit more technical about how to design funnels, how to look at A/B tests, what they can and cannot do. Sound good? What will we not talk about? Very quickly, Fermi problems, strategy questions, how are we designing products, all that. No, we are going to be focused on analytics. Cool. So part 1, analytics as a part of product management. Let's see. So that's another picture of Wayne. I call it Lil Wayne, but anyway. So what do you think a product manager does? And I don't mean like, the terms you hear are he's the CEO of the product or she's the CEO of the product. I mean, well, yeah, kind of. But they don't go in the morning, have their coffee and like, I'm going to be CEO today. What do they actually do once they get to work? And as far as I'm concerned, it's essentially one of these 4 things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. They're ideating, they're thinking about how do I make a new product, how do I improve the product I have, what new features I can add, that kind of thing. Prioritizing of all the things that I've already thought of, which are the ones that I want to actually work on. Persuading, now that's kind of like always a little bit the understated part of the job, but as a product manager, you're spending like half your day talking to your leadership about why you're thinking of a good idea. You have to convince your engineering teams or the UX designer or whoever, because tech companies, as you know, are very democratic. You're very responsible for your own time. So you have to go convince other people to come work for whatever idea you have. So how do you do all that? With data, of course. And finally, the execution bit is, yes, you thought up an idea, you convinced everybody, now you got to go get shit done. So that's where you go and actually build and launch products, track and manage everything. And so when you think about this, what is the product manager doing on a daily basis is they are thinking of change, they are creating change, and then they manage it continuously. So, but that would be chaos, right? Like if you're constantly changing things, that's very chaotic. And the way you bring order to all this chaos is through analytics, through data. You have to think of how do you prioritize with data? How do you convince somebody? I mean, there are smart people that are just not going to go for a moonshot idea until you can show the data, show them what you can actually do. So whenever the interviewer is asking you questions, this is what they're really trying to gauge. Can you identify what data is relevant? If I go and say, hey, I'm going to run Facebook events, cool, but how are you going to run it? What data do you think would you look at if you were to run a feature like Facebook events, for instance? Can you correctly interpret the data? So if something is up or down, do you know how to make sense of it, how to go about even identifying, interpreting it? Can you use the data to persuade others? And that is where the statistical rigor comes in. Because a lot of people are from a tech background, they're from a heavy math background, and from a business background as well. So you have to make sure that the data you're presenting is persuasive. And are you realistic about what data can be collected? Like some things such as user sentiment, for instance, are very, very difficult to accurately gauge. And if you base your whole case on I'm going to measure that, then yeah, that's probably not going to happen. So are you certain that you can collect the data that you want to? And sometimes it just may be an engineering challenge. For instance, you will be surprised how many gaps products are shipped with, and the data that you think will be readily available just may not be available when you're in the job. So you have to kind of think of those things when you're answering these. And lastly, and I think that is probably the most important part, is even if you can identify all the data in the world, do you know which ones you can actually control as a product manager? If my whole thing is based on, say, eharmony.com, my whole thing is based on how many people are single, I can't really control how many people are single, even though there's no way to do that. So which of the data elements can you actually use as a lever to run your product? So in my mind, at least when I'm interviewing, these are the things that I'm looking for. So let's see. Now let's actually get into how do you think about the questions themselves, right? I group all product analyses into these 4 buckets. You guys are all smart, you may come up with one that, hey, that doesn't fall in here, but think about it, it probably will. But in my day-to-day job, like I'd say almost every analysis that I come across would either be sizing the opportunity. Should we launch this product in Hong Kong? How many people are going to use it? That kind of thing. Or should we just launch this feature? How are we going to size an opportunity? Prioritization, like, okay, fine, I have these 3 features now. Which one do I want to work on this year? Because resources are always limited. You only have X engineers or X UX designers to work on things. Success definition. How are you going to use the how are you going to measure your product, and how are you going to define what success means? So I launch a product, I run it for a year. How do I know it's doing well? What am I comparing it against? That kind of thing. And lastly, when you're lucky enough you have a product launched, things will always get messed up. What is going on with that? You launch it, day 3, nobody's using it at all. Like, how do you go about diagnosing what went on with it? And I think when you think about this, I think Adam Nash put it really well. As a product manager, you're really responsible for 2 things. A, you have to know what game you're playing, and B, you have to know how you keep score. So and I think all of this falls under that. What game are you playing? How do you keep score? And that's where analytics comes in. So if you look at example questions for something like this is, say, opportunity sizing. When you hear the interview saying, should we launch something, should we launch this new service in wherever? What they're really asking is, can you identify first what is the size of the opportunity? Of course, there's more to that question, but the basic thing is it worth pursuing? If it's going to make me $800,000, great, but would Amazon pursue $800,000? Would Google do that? So the first thing is you have to even understand how big an idea it is that you have. The other ones, like you may think that's more like a Fermi problem, like how many Italian restaurants are in Seattle or how many X is in Y kind of a thing. But when you think about it, there are only as many restaurants in Seattle as the demand is, right? I mean, that's like a very competitive market. Restaurants will close, open, whatever. So if you can accurately size the demand, if you can accurately say how many people a restaurant would serve, that's basically just an opportunity sizing problem. Prioritization, that always comes up at the end. Usually at the end of a brainstorming session, you say, how many ideas you can think of improving YouTube? You rattle off like 10 things and then say, okay, which one would you do first? And it's like, oh, okay, well, how do I do that? So what are you using to measure everything? How do you go about talking about prioritization? And like of all the features we've discussed, which ones would you build? That kind of thing. This comes up very often in success definition. If you had to pick just one metric, what would you pick? And it's usually, I don't like that question at all. It's like asking what would you look at when you're driving your car? Would you just look at the speedometer? No, I have tons of things to look at, but that does get asked very often, so it's a good thing to have in mind how you're going to answer that. And they're not like looking for one metric. Everybody knows you can't just pick one metric, but the process is more important than these. And lastly, diagnosing issues. Ad revenues dropped by X%, how are you going to do that? Why are product page views down? Something of that nature, that something has changed. How are you going to identify what has changed? So of these, I think we will talk about opportunity sizing first. And the 3 buckets that you see down below, you can actually just take one approach to answer any of those questions, and we'll talk about that in the second part of this. So first, let's talk about opportunity sizing. So again, I'm using e-commerce terminology. You can replace purchase here with whatever other variable that may fit in. But there are 5 things you have to really do. And trying to break it down as simply as possible. One is you have to clarify the scope. So if I ask you something like, okay, how many restaurants should I open? Like, okay, in what city are you going to open them? What is the source of revenue? How are you renting your space? Whatnot, whatever. You would come up with that. Then you identify the base population. And what I mean by the base population is, and we'll talk about these more, but it's basically how many people have access to the service. Not how many people will use the service, but how many even have access to it. Like Seattle Airport, for instance, like everybody has access to it, but does everybody use it? No. And that's where you get to the addressable segments of all the people in your base population. How many are you even going after? Then you purchase frequency is how many times are they going to use your service? And lastly, how much will they pay each time that they use it? And we'll run through an example. So let's think about this question. Okay. Should we launch a bicycle-based food delivery service in Seattle? And I actually did get asked this question one time. So I thought, okay, there may be and keeping in mind that the way I'm describing this, there's no perfect answer to this, right? Nobody knows whether you should start a bicycle-based food delivery service. But what the interviewer is looking for is, are you going through the right steps in your mind? Are you looking at it in a logical framework where you can actually come up with an answer had you enough data at that time? So let's see. What did we say we're going to do first? 2 parts to the answer. What is the size of the opportunity? We'll talk about that right now. But that wouldn't complete the answer, right? If I could say, okay, this is like a $10 million thing, so would I do it? But the other part that falls more under the bucket of strategy and design is, fine, it's a $10 million market. How much of that can I actually even capture? How many other people are doing it? What are the unit economics? If I did it, would I be profitable in the short term, in the long term, however? And does this align with the company's strategy? If you're YouTube, then it does not. I was like, no, I wouldn't do it even if it was profitable because that's not what I'm doing. Will you find enough riders or delivery people, and all of that comes into more of the design of the service rather than how big is the opportunity. So let's talk about this first. To clarify the scope, I mean, in this case, it's really simple. The interviewer gave it to you. You're just talking about Seattle. But the other things that you can clarify is what are the sources of revenue? Are you selling the food, or are you just selling the delivery as a service? What are you actually doing? And when asking for clarifying questions, it's always best not to ask for data directly. Don't go around asking like, okay, how many people are we talking about or whatever. Just make assumptions and ask if those assumptions are correct. And I find that to be a lot more helpful for me to look at what the interviewee is thinking about. If they go about saying, I would ask something like, I'm assuming it's Seattle, is that correct? And they're like, I mean, of course, that makes sense, and you're assuming right. And of course, I mean, the strength of your assumptions also gets tested. I can't go out saying, I believe there are 1 billion people in Seattle, I assume. I'm like, no, that's not right at all. So you have to make meaningful assumptions. Of course, we'll do clarify that. So let's see. So let's say identifying the base population. So for something like this, what we are saying is the base population, when I talk about a base population, is who has access to your service. It's not like who is actually going to use it, but you're going to base it off of something, right? It can be an industry, it could be a geographical area, a demographic that you're targeting. And in this case, we are saying, what's your unit of measure as well, right? Because I could say that if I'm going after, say, a service like concert tickets, it's per person, every person is going to the ticket, so my unit of measure really is how many people are in my base population. If I was selling televisions, it's probably 1 per household is how I would think about it. If I was a B2B company, I would be thinking about how many businesses in my industry are there. So that's how you're thinking about a base population of this is the entire population that I can serve with my service. So in this case, we are going after households because it's not like every person in the household is going to order food separately. Usually, you will order for the household if something is coming in. So I think I might have skipped over one slide now. Okay, now it is base pop. So base population for this. So I'd say number of households. We are serving Seattle. I just take 800K people in Seattle, about 2.5 individuals per household. That's my base population is 320,000 households. It's always okay to round up or down just to make sure that your calculations are easy enough to make on the fly. nobody's looking for accuracy in these interviews, to be honest. I mean, you have to be in the ballpark, of course, but you don't have to be like precise to the decimal point, which is very different from a consulting interview. How many of you have gone through case interviews for consulting? So you guys know what I'm talking about. Over there, you have to ask for data. You have to be super precise. You're judged on your math. Not as much in a product interview. We're looking more for the strength of your assumptions, the strength of the logic, and which is why I also encourage people not to like keep asking for data like you do in a consulting interview. You're basically making assumptions that make sense. So you go with that. Now, this is where you get to become creative. Now, you have a base population set. You say, OK, this is how many people are going to have access to my service. Now you start whittling out how many people are actually going to use your service, and they are your target segments. And you can use basically any idea here really to come up with, say, okay, how many people can even afford to eat out? How many people are going to be in the area that is serviceable? Like, you can come up with X number of factors to whittle down your base population down to a logical addressable segment. For instance, if I was going to start a charter plane company from out of Seattle, my base population would be everybody in Seattle, I guess. But if I'm thinking about addressable segments, I probably would not be a target customer for it. I can't drop 20,000 on a flight. So I'd look after who can actually drop 20,000 on a flight. How many of them are even traveling on a frequency good enough? And that way, I whittle it down to an addressable segment. And how many of those are there? So let's see, what fraction of the base population is addressable? And like I said, no wrong or right answer. Here's how I would do it. I would say we are delivering by a bicycle, so speed is a constraint. You can only deliver X miles on a bicycle. So I would just look at places where restaurants and people are concentrated. So I'd say I'll start with downtown Ballard, Green Lake, and Capitol Hill. And some of you are, hey, my area is not here. I'm like, sorry, but these are the 4 that I thought of. You can add more if you want. But you get the general idea. I said these are the areas I can think of where it would work. And let's assume 50% of the households here are ordering in all the time. So adjusting for all these, 30,000 households are now my target segment. That number may be wildly off. I don't know. Doesn't really matter. But as long as my logic is strong enough, I say this is how I'm going about calculating it. The interviewer knows that given enough time, yeah, you'll go on Google all these numbers and come up with a really good answer. But you know what questions to ask, and that is important. So we're going down to like, OK, 30,000 households. And this is where you start with the next part, which is how do you look at the purchase frequency? So I have 30,000 people who are going to be ordering all this time, but how many times does a person order out? Yeah, who knows, right? But you have to pick a reasonable unit of measure if you're looking at a weekly or a monthly basis. If I'm thinking about, if I was Expedia.com thinking about a vacation product, how many times people do take a vacation? Maybe twice a year, 3 maybe. So I would go at an annual cadence and go after that number. And I'm looking at eating out. Monthly seems about right. I can think of how many times I eat out a month, kind of extrapolate from that, see how many other people would be doing the same. What assumptions are you making? Same way, you have to be strong about that. If you're assuming it's 5 times a month, then why do you think it's 5 times a month? And it can be anything. You can say, I looked at industry data, it is 5 times a month, or I eat 5 times a month. People in my age group eat 5 times a month. And that's not a very good answer because it's very anecdotal, but you don't have any basis for really making an assumption there. So you start with something, as long as it makes sense. How many of you watch Colbert? Have you heard of truthiness? So as long as it's truthy enough, it makes sense. As long as the logic holds, the numbers can change. I mean, they know you can go out and find the numbers, but your logic has to be rock solid there. So let's see, we have that. How many, and the purchase frequency. And for physical products, I mean, this is just a delivery service. But if you were talking about toasters, how many toasters does a person buy? Well, I mean, even if you knew that, OK, we are going to sell 10 people have toasters, how many of them are buying replacement toasters? So you have to always think about the replacement purchase as well when you're thinking about a physical product or something that has a set lifespan. So in our case, it's just a service. There's no replacement service. It's like how many times they're using it a month. So I am just going to pick a number, say 3 times on average is how many people are eating out a month. Now 30,000 households was my target segment. They are eating out 3 times a month, or ordering in 3 times a month. Maybe they're eating out more often, but I actually looked up this number. An average person eats out about 6 times a month. And I'm going to say, OK, 3 people, 3 times they're just ordering in instead of going out because they're whatever, they want to watch a show. So yeah, 3 times. So 90 times per month, 90,000 times per month is how many times people will use my service. So lastly, what does that mean in terms of revenue? So you may not even have to get to this stage. I mean, the interviewer could be very, he could just basically just ask you directly, how many people do you think will use this? And you're done at that point. But it's always when you're thinking about the size of an opportunity, if there is a revenue associated with it, and there always is, you wouldn't be running like things just like that anyway. So it's always good to bring it home with a revenue number at the end. So what is the unit price? Typically, the interviewer will also not give you a price per delivery or whatever number you're looking at. But you can, again, make an assumption based on industry standards if other products exist. So in this case, who are your competitors? You can think about Uber Eats, Amazon restaurants, Postmates, DoorDash, whatever. We know how much they charge. So you can say we have to price it accordingly or somewhere in that ballpark. If it is something completely new to the world that you have never used before, it's a teleportation device, how would you price it? What's the next best thing to a teleportation device? You would take a flight and get to some place. But then if you're saving 4 hours, what is that 4 hours worth in time? And then you can extrapolate from that and say, this is how I would price a teleportation device. So if it's not new to the world, base it on whatever competitors are doing, whatever other people are doing. You can base it on cost as well. If you're really in growth mode, you don't care about profits right now, you just want to recover your costs. If it's completely new to the world, then you look at what is the next best option that this person can use who is using my product, and what is the value I'm adding over that product. And that you can then extract. I mean, ideally you want to extract all that value, but you really can't. So it's going to be somewhere between the next best and whatever value you are adding. So based on that, let's see. We're just going to say $5 per delivery sounds reasonable. That is what everybody else charges. That's what I'm going to charge. And people will pay for it because it's a bicycle, it's environmentally friendly, whatever. That's how we'll market it. So, okay. So we do $5. So we bring it together. We said total households 320. We are only going to address 30,000 households because of X, Y, and Z. They're buying 3 times a month from us, $5 per delivery. And then we are going to make about $5.4 million annually. Yay. So good money. But so that's your opportunity size, right? I mean, we just went through all the steps. We came up with the number. But that doesn't complete your answer. We're not going to complete this answer in this session, by the way. We're just looking at the analytics piece of this. The next part that we are not talking about is, so you come up with the opportunity size. You're like $5.5 million. That's awesome. But should we do it? And that's where the strategy piece of product management kicks in, right? Should we do it? And that's an easier question to answer because you know in this space how many competitors are there. What are their benefits? Like Uber Eats can just pick up from one place, deliver to another. They don't have a constraint on distance. And you can think about what are our competitive advantages versus others. What fraction of the market can we meaningfully even capture? That would complete the answer, of course. And is it even going to be profitable? Like how much are you going to pay the rider if you're only charging $5 in delivery that he's going to take half an hour to make? So it may not be a good idea at all. But like we said, we are only discussing the opportunity sizing here. So to summarize, 5 steps, you can basically, I mean, in my mind, there are very few things that you can't size using this. Of course, like I said, I'm using purchase here. You could use whatever else. Like if it was how many people are going to use events, it's kind of a similar flow, but instead of purchasing, they're clicking on something or doing some action that I'm just calling purchase over here in my example. So, of course, I mean, other things you want to know about is seasonality, regional differences. Got to talk about those as well. So the next part, of course, is all 3 of these: prioritization, success metrics, and issues diagnosis. Like I said, you can have one framework to deal with all these disparate questions, and we will talk about that. So questions around these, we talked about those already. All the ideas, which one would you implement? If you had to pick one metric, blah, 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 something dropped 20%, how are you going to do this? So they all have one common theme, and that is, how well do you know or understand a funnel? How many of you are familiar with a funnel? Oh, that's, yeah, you're halfway there already. So what you really have to, so basically, I mean, I'm just describing a very simple funnel. Let's think about an e-commerce website. You have 100% everybody who's entering the site. 70% of those are going to an item detail page, looking at the item, reading it up. 20% are going to add it to cart. 7% are going to checkout, and 3% are completing the purchase. I mean, I totally made up these numbers, but they are close enough for most retail sites. So that's, of course, one funnel. What I'm looking for as an interviewer is, like I said before, do you understand the game we are playing? And this is how you understand the game you're playing. If you're an e-commerce site, these are the rules. This is how a person will navigate your site, and do you understand that at the onset? The second part, of course, is do you understand all the inputs and outputs that go with this? So your total site visitors, what are the inputs to that? Your marketing, your search engine optimization, how many times you come up on a search result, your seasonality, like of course if it's the 4th of July, then Expedia is going to do much better. Prime Day, Amazon is going to do better. Christmas time, everybody does well. So like, do you understand that as well? So that some of that you can control. Seasonality, of course, you cannot control, and those are things that you have to kind of know intuitively. And as you practice more, you kind of get there. The detail page, how many people are visiting it, that completely depends upon you. A lot of it depends upon you. For instance, how many items are you showing on the home page? How many items do you even have in your catalog? First of all, relevance, are you showing the right things to the customer? Price, UX quality. I won't go through all of these, but to give you an idea, everything has inputs, and how quickly and easily can you identify those inputs? Now, one way to practice for a product management interview is just think of any service. Think of like Facebook events, think of Google Calendar. Can you draw a funnel for that? And can you understand the inputs and outputs for each step in the funnel? And if you can, and the quicker you can do that, the better that interview goes. Because right at the onset, you have a framework of how you're thinking about it, that you understand the rules of whatever game you're playing that day. So those are inputs and outputs. Yeah, some of these you obviously cannot control, like product ratings and reviews. If you were doing that, that would probably not be the most ethical thing to be doing. But yeah, there are levers here that you cannot actually control. So what we do as product managers, for the most part, is we design features that will impact one or more of these inputs, and we try to raise each step in the funnel, whatever that funnel may be. Here we are talking about an e-commerce site, but if you were talking about Facebook events, for instance, how many people are, discovery would be the top of the funnel, how many people are discovering it, how many people are clicking on it, how many people are creating an event, whatnot, that kind of thing. So you have to think about, first, how quickly can you design the funnel, how quickly can you identify what inputs are relevant, and what features can you actually build to impact any of these inputs. For instance, relevance is a good one. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to do because it is basically, you could probably use a machine learning algorithm, but if you go into that, then if you don't understand machine learning very well, that's probably not the first one I would pick to go into. Price, you can play with price, but that's not also a very good one to pick too. You still want to be profitable. And if you're a market like Amazon, you can't always control the price. Well, you can too, but for the most part, you can't always control the price profitably, I should say. The rest, there's a lot of leeway, and the same you can think about Facebook events as well. The example I was giving, the other example that I was giving, you can say as a product manager, you could say, okay, you know what I'll do is I'll plaster Facebook events all over my website, and that way a lot of people will see it, everybody would click on it, but what does that do to the company strategy? What does that do to the customer experience, somebody coming on Facebook? So when you're thinking about the inputs, what features are you building for these inputs, and how does that kind of integrate with the rest of your website, with the strategy of the company, and where it's going? So that's on basically what we do with these inputs. You talk about prioritizing. Let's think about, you always have to go down for the impact, right? This is where you'd get asked, okay, you described all these features that are going to control all these levers. Which one would you implement? So the first, say, if, for example, I'm saying I come up with two features. One is I am going to have a lot more items than I have right now. I'm going to have my icons will be smaller. I can show more to the people or whatever. My relevance is better. However I do it, I'm going to now increase the item detail page views from 70% to 80%. In the second case, I remove friction at the checkout step. Maybe there was a security thing that I'm saying, okay, instead of re-entering your credit card, now you can just use the card on file, or you don't have to re-enter something, or I take away something that improves this to 17. So that's 14, this is 17, awesome, right? 17% more. But the point that's missing from this slide is that the goal though? As a company, right now, is revenue my goal, or am I just wanting to improve growth? So the first thing is, like, of course, you have to understand what you're impacting before you come up with that. So the steps really are, what are the features? How much are they going to impact the metric that matters? And I think that's one that you have to talk about the interviewer and kind of get a sense of what metric is the most important in this stage of the company. Like for an early stage company, growth would probably be the most important one. Revenue would be. For more mature companies, you're looking at profitability, more revenue, expanding to other things. They may not care as much. Well, I mean, everybody cares about growth, but they may have be at a point where something else is more important to them. So identify what is the metric that you're optimizing for, which one of your features that you described hit that metric the most. And that's how you would frame the answer to what feature would I prioritize of all the ones that I just described. And the same thing helps you with troubleshooting as well, right? If I say that, okay, all my revenue is down, and usually the interviewer is going to ask you a metric that is really down the funnel. So I can come up with my revenue is down 20%. How do you diagnose that? And what the questions that will get you there is, first of all, you have to understand the funnel steps, right? How did you even get to your revenue in the first place? How many people came to the site? How many people looked at it? How many people bought something? How much did they pay for it? That's your revenue. So as long as you can identify all the steps that are leading to that metric, then you can just backtrack and say, okay, where's the dip? Did our total users drop? So I generally start going down the top of the funnel. Did our total users drop? No. Okay, so everybody's still coming the same as they were. Did our page views drop? If yes, then I know that something is going on over there, which is preventing users from hitting the detail pages. So once you have identified the right step in the funnel, then it becomes easier, right? Because you can have, now the funnel also, another thing I wanted to mention is, the funnel varies by your platform. The funnel can vary by segments. Say in this case, I'm saying 50% of my views were on mobile, the other 50 were on web, and maybe they behave differently. It is easier, a lot more people check out on the web than they do on mobile, for instance. A lot of people would act differently. So once you know the step in the funnel, you can also see which platform got impacted the most, which user segment got impacted the most, and that way you can keep digging down until you can identify those. I had one of the more interesting analyses I had done was at Groupon, where we had a dip that was, we went through all these steps, and you basically just couldn't identify where it was going on. It just seemed across the board. But everything was on mobile anyway, so we didn't know where it was, and it came down to screen size. If somebody was using an iPad, they had a better experience than somebody who was using like a smaller phone than that. So I mean, there are things that can come down to that level of detail. In an interview, it's probably not going to happen, but knowing what to look for does get you a long way there. Now, the third one, this is kind of my favorite topic actually, A/B tests. How many of you here run A/B tests or are familiar with them on a regular basis? Oh, very cool, plenty of people. Very good, so you have a lot of context on this. For those who are not, we'll do a very quick primer. A/B tests basically are, you just create a feature. A is control, B is treatment. I was going to launch a product. I would split this room into half. This half only gets to use the feature that, use the website the way it was before. This other half sees the feature. And then after a certain number of time, I will compare the metrics between the two and see if it did better or worse. So basically, just 4 steps to it. Once you have designed your test, you have to select a metric. What are you measuring between these two groups? Okay, I'm going to measure your performance versus there, but what is it I'm measuring? How many times did you come to product school? How many times you didn't? Or like, if I was looking at product school, it would be attendance, I guess. But Brian is looking at me like that, so I'm not going to go down that path. But if I was looking at basically this room, it would be a different metric than I was if I was looking at the website, for instance. So we select a test metric, calculate a sample size. Depending on your metric, you will need to know how many people should be in both groups to get a statistically rigorous result. And this group is too small for like running a real A/B test. It would just be very anecdotal, but you'd be talking in like thousands or millions even, depending on the metric that you pick and where in the funnel your metric lies. Then you run the test, and then basically at the end of it, once you have the right sample size, you compare the results. So we're going to talk about a lot of mistakes that people make when running A/B tests. One is a lot of people pick the wrong metric. At a company I was running the analytics team, and we were getting a lot of push from the business to use profit as a metric, saying that every time that we are running a test, we should see if one is more profitable than the other, because you could be selling more, but if we are just selling, you just reduce the price to $1, the other group is going to do really well, but like that's not what we want. But the problem is that financial metrics are really hard to measure with an A/B test. The key is variance. The higher the variance, the more noisy your metric is, and the bigger a sample size you need for that. So it can actually, if in that example, if you're looking at just a financial metric like profit, the variance is so high because one user could be buying a pack of toothpicks, the other one is buying a plasma TV on Amazon, and the variance was already so high. I can't just look at those two and say, hey, this group is doing better. They just made like $10,000. But so that's key over there. And literally it can take years. The other part to remember is where in the funnel is your metric. If I'm just looking at the checkout page, for instance, then even if like 1 million people are hitting my websites every day, of that maybe like 30,000 are hitting the checkout page. So it'll take me a lot longer to get to sample size if I'm changing something downstream. Does that make sense? So yeah. So the further up your metric is, the faster you'll get to sample size. The further down it is, the longer you'll need depending on how many people actually get to that feature. So I like picking really low variance metrics such as orders per user. It doesn't matter how many people, whether somebody's buying like the toothpicks or the plasma TV, they're just buying one thing. So did they convert would be my metric. I can have another one about revenue would be a hard one to measure, but I can like measure that differently. Most features will not affect the price of it until you're really playing with that. The second one is a lot of people misunderstand statistical significance. Those of you working with A/B tests, you'll get the question a lot about, okay, when will this experiment get to SS, statistically significant? Like, I don't know, maybe it'll never get to significance. You don't run a test until it gets to significance. If you let it run for infinity, everything will get to significance eventually. Because at some point, you're measuring such minute changes that you will start seeing significant results. But the way you do it is you select a sample size, you run the experiment to sample size, you stop at that point. Either it is different or it's not, and that's when you can actually tell. So you can use Evan Miller's A/B testing blog is a resource I use a lot that can show you how to pick sample sizes. It has a lot of background on this, on what you can and cannot test. Here's the next one, is peeking at the results. And this happens a lot as well. You start running a test and you say, hey, you know what, well, let me look at that now. How is my group doing, my feature doing versus the other, versus the control group? And don't do that. Not until you hit sample size. And to illustrate that, we ran, I think this was about 100 experiments, just random ones. And you'll see over here, almost 60% of them, and you can't tell from this blur over here, but 60% of them showed statistical significance at some point or the other right after we launched the experiment. And that's just noise. You really can't make any decisions from that, but a lot of people want to get early data because you want to do things faster. At the end of it, once you did get to sample size, there was only one experiment that was actually statistically significant. So patience is key, which is why A/B tests are hard to sell to management, because it takes a lot of time, and a well-designed A/B experiments are really hard to find, to be honest. And the last one is ignoring seasonality. And I think this would be true for basically any analytics question that you're answering. On a high traffic website, like if I need a sample size of even a couple of million, I'll probably reach it in a few hours. But that does not tell me how people would behave on a Sunday or a Monday or whenever else. So when you're running a test or you're thinking about a metric, you also want to understand the seasonality. You want to make sure that you're running everything long enough. And yeah, that's kind of key as well. And lastly, there are situations when you truly cannot use an A/B test. And say for content-based services like Netflix or Amazon Prime Video, you can't really show a customer a certain set of movies and not show it to another. You really need to do that. Legal issues, you can't really play with closed captioning in the US. You have to show closed captioning to everybody when you're streaming a video. So there are issues where you really cannot truly hide a feature from people. And what you do there is a pre-post analysis. You basically just launch the feature, see how things were doing before it launched, and then you measure after how it launched. And that's a very messy way to do it. Not, I mean, kind of a last resort thing, but it happens a lot more than you would think because things are always changing. A/B tests take too long for people, so they just do pre and post. But the things to watch out for there are that in your post, there will be a lot of other features affecting it. Like for instance, if there is a lot of marketing going on that is outside of your feature and that's impacting traffic to your site, that will show up as a spike in the post period, but that has nothing to do with your feature, for instance. So it's very hard to take away external impacts unless you're doing everything at the same time with an A/B test. But I mean, you're left with the tools you're left with if you don't have them available, if you don't have better ones available. So that was essentially all on A/B tests. And to close, I'll just go through this one. How many of you have heard this? If you can't manage it, you can't show of hands. Just very few people. All right. Did you know that Drucker actually did not say this? Deming said this. And so if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And one more twist in the story, Deming didn't even say this. Deming said this. It is wrong to suppose that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's a costly myth. That's the exact opposite of the quote that everybody says in every meeting. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Like, you can't measure everything. Anyway. And what Deming meant was not that you should chuck away data. It's basically you cannot measure everything. You should be as data-driven as possible. But beyond that, you have to basically just manage the things you can without the data. And to be honest, I mean, product management is basically you are running a business. It's a lot about risk-taking. You can't really wait for all the data. You have to use a lot of your own intuition. You have to use your judgment, which is why I keep emphasizing on the logic and the approach is more important than the actual data itself. Because you can get the numbers. I mean, but yeah, that was basically all I had. And I promise this is the last dog picture. Thanks, everyone.
One thing that you didn't talk about when you're interviewing people is sort of the rule of unintended consequences. You talked about, like, if we make checkout easier, that's great, but of course removing friction, there's a cost to it.
Yes.
You're maybe removing security. You know, it's always
yes, absolutely. Yes.
So wouldn't you then follow up and ask the question?
I'm glad you caught it, because as I was saying this, it was going through my mind, and then I just forgot to mention that. But yes, it would. I would catch that and say, okay, so you just removed a security feature. What do you think is that going to do? And well, it is going to improve, not improve, but increase fraud. It's going to improve that metric. But yeah, so that would definitely be a good follow-up question there. And so yeah, you have to think about the consequences of those changes as well, and what other parts of the business that it would impact. And I think we kind of touched about that on the events example. Like, I can plaster my feature all over the website, but that has the effect of really pissing off my customers. Yes?
So you mentioned that profit or revenue is probably a high variance
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like measuring.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like, for instance, if I'm changing, say, you know, like my menu
Mm-hmm.
or like something that impacts every step
Mm-hmm.
of your entire funnel,
Sure.
then like what kind of indicator should I use
So,
then?
so when you think about that feature, you're changing a menu. You're not really changing the categories that people go to. Unless you're doing that, then if I'm funneling more people to, say, my cosmetics instead of electronics, then that would change things, of course. And then you would catch that. So the way I like to do that is break it down. So if you're looking at profit, it is what orders per user is one thing you're looking at, then price per order or something of that along those lines. So you would track that, but I don't think that would be ideally your test metric. And I think you would catch it more in the design phase itself. Like, if your metric is going to affect another team or another group that is actually servicing the high value items, I think that would get caught more in the business strategy phase of things than all the way downstream to actually measuring the change itself. But it's a good point. I mean, you could have impacts that are wider than that. But if you have more orders, then you'd probably look at, you could segment the A/B test by your categories as well and say that for this thing, was the impact consistent across all my categories, including the high value ones? So that way you could possibly look at, if you're still getting the same amount of orders between the two, then you haven't really changed anything with the pricing. So you'd still, if the effect is the same between the two groups that you're looking at, you're still fine, right? So you could probably chop it down by all your categories and look at the test results that way. Yes.
So you mentioned a case from your Groupon experience where you figured out that there was a drop in sales or something because of the screen size.
Yes.
So that is a very that is the least thing I would notice is
Sure.
a drop. So how did you come to that conclusion?
So it was, we'd basically exhausted all other avenues at that point. So we were looking at, so we caught that when we were looking by platform, actually. So everything was fine except for the OS was fine too, but when you break down OS by device, that is when we started noticing that an iPad was doing fine, but we had issues with an with a phone, with an iPhone 6 and actually even more with an iPhone 5. And then we started running correlations between screen size and the drop itself. So it's a hard one to figure out. That's why I use it as an example, because you can get down to that level. Most analyses are not to that level. You can typically figure out what went wrong. And 60 to 70% of the time is just a technical issue. Somebody forgot to deploy it on one platform altogether, and then that's messing everything up. Yes?
You brought something interesting up when you talked about Netflix and A/B testing.
Yes.
So something that they've been doing, and I'm fairly certain it's not an A/B test, but I'm curious in your input, when you said you can't alter the content itself, you've been altering the represented image or like leading image that a user sees while they're making their choices. Have you ever had experience with, or would you ever try to influence user impression based on content representation as opposed to content itself?
The content representation, we play with that a whole lot, all the time. So you would see that. The content itself is a little bit trickier to play with because you can't show the same one movie to one person, a slightly different movie to another. I mean, you could test with that, but if you get caught, that's just bad PR all over. So it's probably not worth the cost to do that. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that small companies usually care about growth, large companies revenue, profit. Any other metrics that come to mind from your experience?
Let's see. I mean, traffic. How do you increase traffic all the time? Sorry.
Referral.
Yeah, referrals. Yeah, referrals. That would be a good one to look at. How many people are referring others to it? So I think when you look at the AARM metrics, the acquisition, adoption, retention, and I'm forgetting the M now. But anyway, it's basically monetization. So if you look at the acquisition metrics, I think the acquisition would be the most important one for a growing startup, and then going down that funnel. Yeah. So that's, I guess that also shows you how important the AARM thing is outside of your interviewing. Once you've been doing it for a while, you probably just get focused on the part that you're doing. Yes.
If you get a question to ask you to weigh pros and cons of a service,
Yeah.
how would you approach it?
Pros and cons of a service.
Or product?
A product. I think that would fall more under the design and strategy piece of it rather than just analytics. You can, if you're comparing features, you can probably use a metrics-driven approach. If you're looking at your service versus somebody else's service, you can't really compare that. I mean, you can compare that with analytics, saying, okay, this is where customer sat would be one thing where we can affect more, or if we have like a shorter, in our case, if we can reduce the delivery time versus somebody else, then that's a pro. But if we can't get enough drivers for our service, that's a con. So you can still pick the metrics that you use to compare one service against the other. But for the most part, that you do that as more as a strategy question than just using analytics. Yes.
I imagine that your team has a custom tool that you use, but do you have, outside the custom tool that you use, do you have a tool that you like to look at this stuff?
Yeah, I use.
Or with Redshift, what's the recipe?
So we do have custom tools. However, I use other tools. I use SPSS a whole lot, IBM SPSS. I use Tableau. That's one of my favorite tools. And just regular SQL stuff. So I think, if you can, we use Redshift, of course, a whole lot. So if you know how to query Redshift, that's always a good skill, at least in an Amazon interview.
Redshift with Looker or something?
I use SQL Studio. And I have an Oracle tool that does that. But there's just querying Redshift, there's tons of tools out there. Yes.
So I'm going to stop there.
Sure.
What's the way to measure, what are some good metrics to decide to differentiate a product?
Well, that's a very broad question, right? I think it goes back to what game are you playing? So if you were looking at, depends on the product really. Because the metrics that would differentiate a product, then I think in that case, you're looking at the industry altogether and what are the metrics that the industry follows. Like if I was looking at online advertising, then I would look at what the funnel looks like for online advertising and then compare that across Google and Facebook and whoever else is doing it and go that way. So I think it depends upon the industry itself. If you can draw the funnel for the industry and then you can compare across the funnel for different competitors and see which one is doing better. Does that give good direction?
When Facebook was launched,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was on it. Now my mom's on it. For a different
Yes.
demographic. I guess we're not different customer segments with Facebook. So that was not a metric for the product differentiation. And I don't see different variants of Facebook besides the mobile and the desktop experience. Right? So how would they go about it?
I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question correctly. You're saying how would they treat their different segments, or is
There's
Facebook?
ways you could segment your customers.
Yeah.
It could be by behavior, or demographic, or the way they use your product. I haven't seen Facebook do that.
I see. I'm sure they do. I mean, the whole business is personalization, right? Like the way your mom sees the feed is very different from how I see it. Like my dad just sees political stuff, I imagine, because that's all he shares, but I don't see any of that. So they're already doing that, but I guess because it just puts you in that bubble, you can't really see what they're doing with the others. But personalization is probably key to everything they're doing now.
Yours is mostly dogs, I presume.
Mine is, yeah, all dogs actually. Yes.
So during the ideate phase, what sort of frameworks do you use to drive, say, brainstorming sessions?
It is, a lot of it is basically, I don't know how to say this, but you know how you just get all the members of your team together, start writing out ideas on Post-its and you start putting them up on the wall. And for ideating, it's usually we use that as a team exercise more than just like a solo exercise. I mean, of course, you can, by yourself, you can come up with a lot of good relevant ideas for your product. But in general, it is to do a whole lot with what other parts of the company are doing as well. So to give you an example, and I think I can talk about it without getting in trouble. I mean, it's open like, so we launched Prime in many different countries, the 2-day shipping service. And that may have a lot of impact on my business because Prime Video is offered with Prime in every country, right? So if I say that I'm going to just launch Prime Video in X country, then I probably have to also deal with Prime. So the ideation piece, I would have to include a lot of other teams and see what other ideas we can get in. Typically what we do is we'll get the Prime Video team together, we'll come up with like 13 different ideas across the board and see which ones make sense, which ones we can actually do, and which ones will have more impact. So I don't know if it directly answers your question, but the ideation part is really how creative you are, and that's one of the key things you are doing as a product manager. So there's very few frameworks you can actually use to get really creative other than just knowing your business and getting creative, I guess.
Did you ever use conversion rate as a metric to measure an A/B test?
Yes, all the time.
You mentioned kind of revenue per order, cost
Yeah.
per order.
So conversion rate is one of the biggest ones. Like basically, if you're looking at orders per user, in the example I was giving, that's essentially a conversion rate, right? Yeah, how many people are converting and how many are placing orders. So that's the metric I would measure against control. Yes.
When did you transition from software engineering?
Lots of things. I think with software engineering, I mean, there's opportunities to get creative, but with product, you kind of own the product. With software engineering, you're working on a lot of other people's ideas. You can, of course, be creative with how you write the code, but with product, you are actually coming up with the ideas. You own the product, and then you work with a lot of different people to make it work. So I think key for me was it was a lot more creative, at least for me. Not saying that engineering is not, but it's a lot more creative, and there's more ownership of the product altogether. And I think that was probably key for me.
So funnels are pretty restrictive sometimes.
Yes.
So I've heard that sometimes what people do is they decide to like record the screen itself or like record the interaction. When you decide that your funnel isn't working, you need to try something more intense.
Sure. I mean, so when you think about it, funnels are restrictive, but they give you a framework of how to think about it. If you think about how the users are interacting, your funnel is not always going down, right? You have one step, and then a person may go back to the home page. So your funnel is more like loops rather than a straight funnel. But the way I like to think about these things is you have to have a simplified framework. We can all keep adding complexity to it later on, right? Once you have a base funnel, you are, in this case, you want the people to go down that route and go down the happy path. There are complexities. Yeah, more people go down to the home page and then go down. In fact, we did that at Groupon. We filed a patent for Markov chain analysis where depending on how the user got to the page they are on, what is the probability that they'll go to the next page? And then we try to divert them to the page that is most profitable for us. So there's a lot of different ways you can think about it. You're exactly right. Funnels are restrictive, but they give you a framework, and then you can add complexity to that framework. But you have to start with the right simplistic framework, and then you can keep making it more complex.
Similarly with A/B tests, like
Mm-hmm.
does Amazon use like multi-arm bandits?
Yes, we do. So yeah, so I can't get too much into that, but yeah, we use a lot of different varieties of A/B
I
tests.
feel like there are a lot more advanced things that
Mhm.
exist.
Yeah, they do. But I mean, at the end of it, like for a lot of features, A/B tests are good enough for the job at hand. I mean, you can design a lot of different tests, but for most things, you can get away with an A/B test. Especially with the field that I'm in, with streaming, it's basically you're just changing visual elements for the most part, and you can just A/B test most of them.